begin. So we're looking at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein today, which seems, I think, a little bit of a unnecessary digression from the course material since it's so heavy, and I've always questioned whether I should exclude it rather than include it, and if I were confident that everyone had read it beforehand, then I wouldn't include it, but these days I don't think I can assume that people have read it, and I'm sure, show of hands, who read it before the class? Some of you have. Good. And you probably read it here for the first time, I suspect, yeah. So, but I couldn't count on that, so for those of you who've read it, then great. You already had an acquaintance with it. For those of you who didn't, I guess it's a little extra reading. Apologies for that. But it seems to me a very important work for a variety of reasons, even though it precedes our two authors by a century, at least, in part because it deals with the dystopian aspect of science, modern science as it is applied, and connects it in particular with an approach to the understanding of the human. And those two things, I think we can see, are concerns to Tolkien and Lewis. And they become particularly urgent in the light of the First World War, which I talked about last class, and the terrific influence of the two world wars on both men's lives and both men's writings, and so that context. So what Shelley writes as probably, you know, quite an extraordinary idea, but not overwhelmingly persuasive that this is anything other than, you know, far-flung fantasy, not futuristic predictions. In our day, the things that are told in Frankenstein are now becoming possible, and scientists are working on the very things that Mary Shelley was speaking of. And so there's a prophetic element to Shelley's work, and the ethical concerns that she raises, and the human effect of this new science, I think, are a helpful prelude to looking at both Lewis and Tolkien's work. And so I want to look at it for that reason, and I'm going to trace a number of things that are really almost intellectual background, but I can't assume that you have it, and in fact I'm quite sure that you don't. So even if some of it is you're acquainted with, certainly the broad scope will not be. But I want to say something that, and it struck me while I was driving in and thinking about this course, as I have for a number of years. By the way, my book, which is propping up the camera here, was Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences. I've been thinking about this since I began my PhD in the mid-90s, 1995 to be precise, and concerned with the transformation of the humanities into the human sciences and the consequences for that in terms of truth and in terms of Christian morality, etc., etc. So it's the product of an early Christian convert who recognized a serious problem for the Christian in the modern academy, namely not only that my faith was excluded, but much of what had passed as the humanities before were excluded from the conversation. And that change, which is sometimes in the Romantic period, gathers steam as time goes on. As the sciences progress, and as the human sciences displace the humanities in their concerns. And there are various stages in that, but I'm not going to trace the transformation of the university over 2 centuries. That's for another lecture, and it's not this one. But that is what I believe has happened. To help you perhaps identify what's going on here, and this is the thought that occurred to me, in the book of Revelation 12, let me see if I can put it on the screen here. In Revelation 12, there is what I think is, in many ways, the hermeneutic key for reading the book of Revelation. It's important if you're studying Milton and Paradise Lost, and I think it's important even for the purposes of Lewis and Tolkien. Now, it's more explicit in Lewis. He almost explicitly alludes to it in his science fiction trilogy, but even in the Chronicles of Narnia. It's the war in heaven, 12 verse 7, that broke out between the archangel Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And then there's the defeat of that archangel, that is the dragon, and his casting down to earth, where he then works with a beast and the false prophet. So for those of us who are Pentecostal, these are really, I think, quite evocative terms. This idea of this cataclysmic conflict between the city of God and the city of man. The war between Satan, the beast and the false prophet, and the people of God. Milton certainly is evoking it in his Paradise Lost. Lewis was fascinated by this theme, and I think both men are reflecting on in their fantasy works. I suggested in our first class the significance of the Great War, and that will be the beast, if it will. The beast has terrific power to chew up and destroy life, not just human life, but the natural world. Terrific. That'll be Revelation 13, where it talks about the beast and the false prophet. And that's many scholars believe that the beast refers to militarism or martial power, and the threat that it poses. So physical, coercive force. But a greater threat is that of the false prophet, false teaching. And to my mind, the false teaching that takes place in the transformation of the university from a Christ-centered humanities education towards a scientifically ordained attempt to further life through what they will determine and call progress, without defining what the progress is towards, because to make progress you have to be going towards something. Well, what's the thing we're going towards? Never defined. And you can only define it actually in terms of what it's getting away from, and what it's getting away from is a Christ-centered understanding of human nature. And we are living in an age when those things are being negotiated and accepted quite blithely even by Christians. And I will refer you to the advent of transgenderism and so forth, where the human body is seen as something that we can experiment on ourselves, take control of ourselves, and reform our own identity. The terms that are used are of self-identification, right? I self-identify as this or that. In Scripture, nobody self-identifies other than God. Only God names himself. Only God. It's the divine prerogative. So implicit in the language of self-identification, even aside from what happens in gender reconstruction and all that, which is sort of a Frankenstein-esque view of the body where I can work on it and myself, change myself and to be myself, there is this implicit claim to have godlike powers over our own nature. Modern science has delivered it to the individual and said, we will give you a right to this, and we will, by force of law, enforce and prevent people from speaking against it even. It's just the latest development in what I think is something that has been coming for several centuries, going all the way back to Francis Bacon and the attempt to use science to gain power over nature. It began in the natural world, that is the non-human world. Come the 19th century, the gaze gets turned, rather than upon the natural world, upon the human. That's the great shift, and Lewis identifies it in one of his lectures. So now we can come up with whole new fields of intellectual endeavor. They'll have new names: biology and anthropology and psychology and sociology. These are all new intellectual fields. They have their own identification. And people study them exclusively in isolation from all of the other understandings of human endeavor. And the purpose of that is to prevent, this is when I say the purpose, not necessarily, the scientists are self-aware of this, speaking more from the devil's strategy, is that people get focused on minutiae and they lose the big picture. And so they end up doing it in the name of, as we're going to find Victor Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein does what he does for the sake of humanity. And that is a key and common element between the novel Frankenstein and the endeavors of the 20th century. The greatest atrocities in the 20th century take place in the name of bettering human nature. Whether it's communism, or Nazism, or fascism, or the eugenics movement. It's all a totalitarian attempt to control human nature, and the claim underlying it is that we're doing it for the better of humanity. But note that they never define the humanity, and that's because the purpose there is to redefine it. Mm-hmm. They never answer the question, and this is a matter that I raise in my own book on the subject. What is human nature? What are the humanities, the human sciences? What is the human? It's a question that is left begging. Never mind, we'll ignore that question. I say the same thing to my colleagues in psychology. What is it that you are actually studying here? What is the psyche? Is it the mind? Is it the brain? Is it the soul? I can tell you that different schools of psychology come up with a different conclusion on it. All of them are regarded as legitimate branches of psychology, and they all fundamentally disagree with one another. And there is no basic understanding of what the psyche is among psychologists. And yet they're called scientists, and they are regarded as experts on human nature. And so if you really want to help people, you study psychology. And I don't dispute, by the way, the good intentions of those who go into it. And I don't even dispute the good intentions of those who practice it necessarily. I do dispute the capacity for them to come to a good outcome because they haven't defined what they're looking for to begin with in a coherent way. It's not defensible. You can't study something you can't identify. If it's the brain, which is becoming very fashionable in our day, then you have serious intellectual problems. If you think that the brain is your psyche, then you're a materialist. Materialism is almost self-refuting. It's so stupid. Right? Because to study it, you have to have a mind. You have to be able to reason. Well, reasoning, the capacity of reasoning is not a material one. Otherwise, the animals would have it. And even the trees would have it. They would have mind as well, but they don't have a mind. It's ridiculous. But note that those who think that the natural world has something like a spirit like us are collapsing as we speak the difference between the green grass out there, the animals in our presence, and human beings, and talking about animal rights and natural rights and the environment and so forth, as if these were equivalent and there was no distinction between them. Well, that's because they've ignored the basic distinction between human beings and the rest of the created order. They've eradicated it. But that's not accidental. That's their whole opening gambit. We're going to take control of human nature by disregarding the fact that human nature is something that God creates and is thereby defined by Him and thereby is accountable to Him, including our bodies. So Paul will write in Romans, offer up your bodies as a living sacrifice, for this is your spiritual act of worship. So our bodies are an aspect of our spiritual. And then he'll go on to say that we are to no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but rather be transformed by the renewal of our minds. Those two things. So he first talks about the body, Paul does, and then he talks about the mind and the necessity to no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world. Well, what is the pattern of this world? It's begging the question. But note, by the way, that he assumes that we are, as fallen, sinful creatures, we actually are conformed to the pattern of this world and the way it thinks about things. And what is the way the world thinks about these things? It's idolatry. The basic human sin. Adam and Eve want to be as gods. So does everybody who's an idolater. We want to be in control of God. In other words, we want to be God. That's the basic pattern. So you need to be transformed by the renewal of your minds. That's what we come to a Christian university to do. That's what education is. It's the restoration of the ruins of our first parents, as John Milton would say. By learning to know God aright. That's how you begin education. And there is no other pattern. So when I this sounds to those who are not Christian, this sounds to be enormously arrogant, but it actually is the only escape from the conundrum of a self-defining humanity, which is a futile gesture. You can't define yourself. The illustration I used to explain how futile it, try jumping over your own shadow. Because you have to be the subject and the object at the same time. Right? I'm studying human nature. Okay. But then to do that, I have to be detached and objective. I can't be the thing that I'm studying. But how can I do that? How is that even possible? It's not possible. So it's like little kids. You know, there's your shadow, and you try and jump on your head while your shadow moves. Well, of course it does. That's because the thing you're studying is connected to you. You're not dispassionate. You're not. Your findings are not objective. They're tainted by your selfish motivations, whether you want to call them privilege or whatever. The fact is you're not objective in your pursuit. And Mary Shelley's foray into this is to demonstrate that Victor Frankenstein's claim to be a humanitarian and to pursue science dispassionately, objectively, is secretly a very selfish endeavor that destroys everyone and everything around him. Which is, I think, exactly what Lewis and Tolkien, I think, are talking about in their own fiction. So this is the work of the false prophet. It deludes people. It tricks them into thinking they're doing something good and humane, while at the same time destroying the basic faithfulness of all the created order, which comes in recognizing that we are mere creatures, and as such need to be humble. On the other hand, the fact that we bear the image of God means that we are, and bear the image of his Son, Jesus, means that we are above all things besides God. So it's a great and high calling. We need to be humble, being aware that we are only dust, and at the same time, we bear the image of the one true God. And so we bow the knee to no one besides God. This is not that tension is only preserved when we recognize our own limits and we recognize God's authority over things, and we can't invest them in political authorities. So again, the 19th century, it isn't just the human sciences. We see the development of nationalism, the nation state, which are the very things that will unleash the dogs of war on one another in first in the French Revolution, and then Napoleon's army going around Europe, but then in the great battles in the 19th century, the land grabs in the colonialist period, which then lead to the great powers clashing together in the First World War and again in the Second. Right? The development of the nation state. It's not, when you're reading Shakespeare and he talks about England, they don't have a standing army. There's a couple of nobles that he needs to ask for his aid to come to the aid of England. But England, the king has a little bit of power and he's got his own knights, but he needs other knights alongside him. He's not the all-powerful. He can't just summon people, call them, conscript them. Doesn't have that power. He needs aid. But come the 19th century, power gets gathered under one roof behind a, yes, democratically elected government, but largely unaccountable to people and with terrific power to coerce and to indoctrinate. And again, the mass education movement of the 19th century, state schools, is to some degree a good thing, and to another degree it delivers great power over the future into the hands of a few people and takes it away from churches and families above all. So there's a war on the family implicit in that, I think. So Frankenstein, note the title, the subtitle rather, The Modern Prometheus. This is also highly important. This study of Frankenstein, by the way, if I were just studying Frankenstein on its own or as something to do with romantic literature, I'd be teaching it differently than I'm teaching it here. Here I'm using it for the purposes of this course, so take it that way. The modern Prometheus is highly evocative and important here. Who is Prometheus? And why the subtitle? What does she mean when she uses this word? Who's Prometheus, first of all? Does anyone know? Sure.
Is he the one that found fire? Discovered fire?
Yes. So what's his identity then? Who is Prometheus? But you're correct.
Is he a Titan? Or
Yes. Yeah. So he is a sort, the Titans are the earth-born semi-divine creatures or divine creatures just like Zeus. So there's the heavenly host of Zeus and his Olympians. They're the sky gods. But then there's the earth gods, the Titans. So these two are gods. And to some degree, it's the war of the heaven gods against, or the sky gods against the earth gods is a fight between rationality and carnality. So it maybe gives rise to the Greek belief in the powers of the mind. It's sort of a myth that speaks to that. But we'll leave that aside. Prometheus in Greek mythology stole fire from the gods. So he would be pure as fire. Prometheus, fire bearer. He steals fire from the gods. What does he do with it? He gives it to humanity. Therein, he's a benefactor of mankind. He's a humanitarian, if you will, because fire allows mankind to do a great number of things, cook their own food, for instance. Unfortunately, it's a rebellion against the authority of Zeus and his Olympian gods, and along with it, there's a degeneration that takes place. The fire is used to forge metal, and the metal is then used to wage war. So he's a benefactor. So there's a gift that comes with the ability to harness fire. And there's no doubt about it, but he's got that two aspects to it. But for this act, for stealing fire from the gods, he is chained on a mountain in the Caucasus region, which is, gosh, where is this? I think in Iraq somewhere now. Northern Iraq. It would be the Caucasus Mountains. It might be geographically wrong. It might be a bit further east than that. But he's chained to a mountain, and he has his liver eaten out in punishment. This is considered the worst punishment a person could endure. His liver is eaten out every day, and then it regenerates, and then it gets eaten out again. So it's eternal agony for what he has done, giving fire to humanity. It's spoken of in a tragedy called Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus. So that's in the Greek period. Like many myths, the myths are not static things. They're sort of, I think that they are what modern sociology says about Christianity and other religions. They are actually attempts to describe sociologically, mythologically, something that they can observe about human development. And so this idea of Prometheus Pyrphoros shifts in the Roman period, and then he's given a different emphasis, which is that Prometheus himself forms humanity out of the clay. Sounds a lot like a demiurge figure, like God himself, right? Breathing life into the clay. And that's in the Roman period, the development of the myth. I believe you can see it in Ovid in his Metamorphoses. He speaks of Prometheus having done this. But so this takes on renewed significance in the Roman period. But those two things together, you can see that Mary Shelley plays on both aspects here. Because the fire which comes from heaven is harnessed by Victor Frankenstein through a theory of what was becoming just speculative at her time, galvanism. We're going to harness electricity in order to bring life from into inanimate bodies. And thereby, he is forming a new humanity. So this Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, is going to harness the capacities, the technological capacities of modern science to form a new humanity. Now, what he does in the scientific realm, I think, is also taking place in the humanities, in the development of sociology and anthropology and psychology and so forth. I don't mean to make it sound as sinister as that, but I think it has a similar agenda. We're going to form a new humanity according to a template that we are going to determine, or not determine as the case may be. But we're going to conduct experiments on people. You just have to sign off that you're willing to do that, and then it's okay. It's ethically okay once you've consented to it. Correct? We have research ethics, after all. You can't do it without their will. But what if they don't know the consequences of their agreement? Because you, the scientist, the social scientist, don't know the consequences of your agreement because you've never considered what a human being is. Maybe it's inhumane to treat people as if they were lab rats. Even if they agreed to it, you got them to agree to it. Well, they clicked or they tapped a little check box and agreed to it or signed to it. Yes, but what if they didn't know what was going on? The 20th century is also filled with that. People who've been experimented on by others for the sake of, again, the scientists think that they're doing a great good by doing this. There are probably some who are sadists and don't intend good things. I don't think those are the majority. But maybe I'm naive on that. But I don't think there's a mad scientist. Even Victor Frankenstein is not portrayed as a bad guy. Right? The scientists in general are well-meaning, and that's part of the insidious nature of it. They themselves are the most deceived about what they do and their good intentions. And so the horror of Frankenstein is shown less in the portrait of Victor than in the effect of what he does on everyone and everything around him. It's a terrific novel. By the way, Mary Shelley's husband would write his own variation on this, and it was called Prometheus Unbound. But I can tell you the idea of Promethean thought is huge in the whole period. In Germany and in England in particular, the Promethean myth and the attempt to work on human nature is there in the 18th century. So the intellectual, imaginative endeavor of literary figures precedes the scientific endeavors of what we will call the natural sciences, which become then totally divorced from the humanities, by the way. Historically speaking, they fit together. There's the trivium, there's the quadrivium, but they all hold together. Now they're utterly divorced. So if you're in the arts, you're this type of thinker. If you're in the sciences, you're this type of thinker. Now, Mary Shelley is going to particularly underline that in her portrait, but I'll get to that in a bit. Yes, question?
When did that begin to happen? Like, this is 1818. She's already responding to this.
Something that already is existing.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I think you can see it, as I said, in Francis Bacon, in his the early beginnings, in his attempt to see nature as something to be conquered. That's my sense. Some would push it back further to the medieval period and a dispute between the nominalists and the realists. I think that is, I think there's some merit in that opinion, and that's very common in certain Catholic circles. don't think, although I think that's an important phase, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think that's a bit too early. It might be a necessary prelude to what follows. In fact, it is. You know, when I operate on this thing, there's nothing real there. It's just what we call it. So we can call you a human being, but there's no real essence to your human nature, because there's no real essence to anything, because words just are things that we use to describe things, but there's nothing real behind the description. It's a rhetorical gesture. And so when we call upon God, well, you call him Yahweh, but that man calls him Allah, and these call him whatever, and it's all the same thing. Doesn't matter. They're just words, but they mean the same thing. And the reason they mean the same thing, there's nothing real behind the words. So I think it is certainly significant, and Bacon is working on that. By the way, if you're interested in that thesis, Richard M. Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences. It's a good read. Very interesting. Professor of rhetoric, by the way. Sort of an intellectual history. Very good read. Yes?
Do you think there's a difference between trying to better humanity or heal humanity? So I'm thinking like in a physical and then also in a psychological way, like you can heal someone of a sickness, you're not embedding them, you're just healing them, and then from a psychological perspective, if someone is psychologically ill, you can heal them, bring them back
Correct.
to the state that they should be.
So I understand the question. So the question is there a distinction between bettering somebody or healing them? And I think that the distinction is obvious, and that's the dividing line, more or less. Because to heal something is to suggest there was a hole in this before you seek to fix it. Whereas to better it, what does it mean to better it? Can you tell me what the goal is of betterment? Like where is that aim? Classical education, as enunciated by Milton, but as understood by everybody throughout the Christian tradition, up until the Enlightenment, when it starts to transform, is there to heal what is broken, to restore the ruins of our first parents, as Milton put it. So it's to fix something, and not only to fix what is deformed or damaged or hurt or even deficient. Because when you think about education, you are trying to bring children to the knowledge and the love of God in their neighbor. You have to educate them to do that. And you say to the children, here's how you do it. You follow my example. I do it. Now you do it like I do it. And Lewis, in his Abolition of Man, which we'll get to in a few classes, says that the modern educator regards the child somewhat like the poultry farmer does the turkey. I'm going to do things to you that I would never do to myself and would never do myself, and we'll see how that works. And it seems to me transgenderism is a great illustration of this. So for those who think transgenderism is a great thing, well, why don't you do it yourself then? Go on. Inject yourself with hormones. Cut things off. Attach things. Whatever. You really think that's a great idea? It will mess you up. Seriously. Not just physically, but psychologically, hormonally. And again, predicated behind that is there's nothing distinctive about human nature or human sexuality. We're male, female. Biologically, down to the very chromosome, male, female, everything, not just the genitals, right? Everything is male or female. But in the modern scientific view, there's nothing in nature which is not something we can gain control over or not bring under our dominion. And so we can eradicate those basic distinctions in human nature and make it better. And in fact, we have to get rid of the distinctions to make it better, because making it better means bringing it under control. In other words, it's a desire for power over human nature, which I think is rooted in the whole idea of the ring. It's a lust for power over all life. I wonder what the ring is. I think that's it. It's not sin per se. It's the lust for God-like power over ourselves, which is, of course, sinful. But despite its setting back 6,000 years ago, The Lord of the Rings is a modern commentary on the 20th century, which people feel when they read it. They know it's about now. It's not about then. It's not just flights of fancy. And so Lewis and Tolkien, when they're writing their fantasy, are really the most realistic of novelists, which is, to me, fascinating. So that was the answer. So Shelley's commenting on this, and as you said, she's commenting on something that already exists. I mean, she's not inventing it. It has potency precisely because people are saying, yes, I identify that. But the Promethean protagonists in novels, etc., is there 50 years before that, easily. Similarly with theories of evolution, by the way. Evolution as a theory in modern science is already there in the 18th century, long before Charles Darwin is there. Long, long before. And it's just an old theory. It's actually an ancient pagan theory. That's what Ovid presents. That's what Hesiod presents. It's evolution. Things evolve out of other things. There's no creator. It's an age-old battle. It has modern clothing. It has there are differences there, but really, it's an age-old theory of how things came to be. And predicated, the reason why evolution is such an attractive theory is evolution is chaotic, and in order to put any sort of order on chaos, you have to impose it. And it's good and right to impose order, because order is better than disorder. But of course, there's no legitimacy to the order. It's just those who are in power trying to create an order, and they do it not for the sake, as Lewis and Tolkien observed, the great statesmen of their day did not do things in the best interests of their nation states. They sent millions to their deaths for no reason. Yes?
I was just going to make a further comment. It would also be seen as a sense of progress as well.
Of course, because it's the propaganda of the First World War from Christian pulpits around was we have to do it for the sake of civilization, to preserve us. And of course, we are the divinely favored people. Social Darwinism. I talked about that. Which one of us is the most? Well, it's obviously the Germans that are divinely favored, because look at our culture. It's the most advanced. Well, therefore, we ought to rule. It's not only we ought to, we must do that. We have to demonstrate it. Let's just bring it to its outcome. When when the war was going bad against Hitler, he said that the German people who would no longer listen to him, or his generals rebelled, he said, well, then we're going to bring Germany down, because we deserve it. If you won't carry my commands out to their utmost, then Germany deserves to be punished. So he didn't care if his own nation was in the millions were going to die. Didn't care. So he was pursuing an ideal of control. It's on behalf of the master of the race, but if they weren't willing to follow him, the spokesman for that, zeitgeist, spirit of the age, then so be it. He did his best. He was getting rid of all of those who are not fit to live. The gays, the Jews, the psychologically and physically disabled. They had a eugenics program. He was doing his best to better human nature. If they're not going to get on board with it, well, then they're going to become put on the ash heap of history, and so be it. Wow. We call it megalomania. He's not the only megalomaniac of the 20th century. Joseph Stalin, there's a long, long list. So it's not, and this is the thing that I try and say, and it's hard for people to hear in public, I'm not on the left or on the right. It's just the left are ascendant right now. They're in power. The problem is the power. The left just thinks that they can wield it because they're not fascists. I think, yeah, but communists were just as bad. And the problem is not communist or fascist, it's human nature. That's the problem. You can't get over the problem of human. You haven't looked deep enough to identify the problem. You are the problem. And I'm the problem. There's no system of government that's going to solve the problem of human nature other than God's government. So that is the context there. So again, the battle between the beast, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet against God's people. That's, I think, what's being portrayed in these novels. And the backdrop is war. So the beast is there, and it's real. If you're even in a physical fight on the playground, you realize how real a physical fight is. Try imagining when somebody's shooting bombs at you from a distance, you can never see the person, and they're blowing up, people's bodies are flying all over the place around you. And it goes on for years, and you're actually sleeping on the top of corpses, which you don't even have the time to bury. And you can smell, so the smell, in accounts of the First World War, people knew where the battle lines were because they could smell them before they could see them. The stench was so bad. And if you meet somebody who, these days it's almost impossible to find somebody who was alive in the First World War, but the second's not much better, they don't want to talk about it. It's too horrifying. The loss is incalculable. Their friends, the men that they would have died for them. They don't feel they deserved it. They didn't. Any more than those who died deserved it, per se. Horrible. And there's no purpose to it. It seems anarchic. It just seems the purpose of the bloodletting was to let blood, just to kill people. And then, irony of all ironies, and the British are still bitter about it, they won the battle in the First World War and the Second World War, and Germany ends up better for it, and the British end up impoverished, having lost so much. Some truth in it. That was realpolitik. We're going to give the Germans some power so this doesn't happen a third time. Right? So the Americans come in and prop up the German economy, let them get back on their feet with a Wirtschaftswunder, like economic miracle. Now Germany's an economic powerhouse in the world. No military. Okay. Did they get rid of the propaganda? No, because that's everywhere. That is throughout the Western world, the propaganda of trying to control human nature. So that's there in Frankenstein. Now let me talk about a few aspects. As I said, I'm not teaching this as I would conventionally. It is a Gothic novel. So the setting is in the medieval period. When I say the medieval period, it's not set in the Middle Ages. The early pursuit, but most Gothic novels are. It's set in the midst of Switzerland, and early on, Victor Frankenstein, the scientist, is pursuing and is fascinated by alchemy. And the old alchemists, Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus and so forth, and he's fascinated by this pursuit of things like the Philosopher's Stone and so forth, the one element that will allow people to gain power over nature. It's a pursuit of magic, is what it is. And I think there's an interesting and obvious connection between the blind pursuit of the goods of modern technology. By the way, everyone who has one of these thinks that the latest mobile phone is the best one. Why? Because it's new. And also because it's more powerful. Okay, so that is, you can't dispute that. But what's the effect of the latest cell phone on you? Because it changes you as well. Everything we use changes us. So the tool is a tool for us, but we also conform to it. How many people are glued to their cell phones like this? See people in public gatherings, their heads are bowed to the cell phone, the almighty, all-holy cell phone. I'm not immune to this. It's not a criticism of certain individuals. It's just there. There is a cost to it. And what's the effect on human relationships? If you ever watch the movie American Beauty, it talks about which is a really sick film, by the way. Academy Award winner. It's a fellow, he can only desire women through technology. There's a girl beside him who is trying to seduce him, and he's just sort of indifferent to her until he can film her. And even then, it's just sort of this, the technology is a means of capturing something. And we talk about capturing a photograph, or whatever, and it's a meaningless, awful film in some ways, but I think it's sort of symbolic of gaining power over things and at the same time losing the ability to even be aroused. Internet pornography has the same effect, by the way. Hugely addictive. Removes physical desire. Makes it impossible for people to be aroused by the opposite sex, because nothing is quite so attractive to the dopamine emitters in our brain as the way the visual image works through modern porn on the internet. It's horrific. Heads drop because people have done it themselves in the room, and I get it. And I'm not accusing anybody, I'm not thinking about anybody. I just know I was a college and career pastor. I've looked at the stats on it, and they are huge. Used to be just people thought it was men. It's women. Of course it is. How could it not be? The technology's there, and it lures you in. Look at it. Cause of great shame, whatever. We're sinners, okay? Repent. Get help. You can be healed, right? It's possible. This is not you're not rendered powerless, but the technology to some degree draws you in and makes you feel powerless. You feel like you can't help it. Same effect of the ring of power. You put the ring of power on once, and it becomes more powerful to you. And every time you put it on, you fall more into the realm of shadow, and more under its power, and then you can't even stop thinking about the ring. You'll find that your phone is by your bedside, and you gotta look. It's a psychological trigger. By the way, those are the creators of these things, horrid things in Silicon Valley, don't let their kids use them. That should tell you all you need to know. Yes?
The frightening thing is, I think Dr. Mass said you don't even have to have the ring on your finger. Look at Boromir.
Correct.
Boromir is a classic example.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that because he's a great hero.
I know.
But what's he after there? It's power, but it's power because he wants to do something good with it. I mean, genuinely wants something to do something good with it, and he's a brave man. But the one thing you can't do with the ring of power is wield it. You must destroy it. You can't even set it aside. If you set it aside, it would destroy his mind, Gandalf says. It would prey on him, and it would destroy him because it's just simply because it was there. The only thing you can do is to transfer the analogy is to nail it to the cross and let it die. And that's what Frodo is effectively doing by bringing the ring to destroy it. The most humble of all the creatures in Middle-earth. The one who thinks least of himself, who has no power, no wisdom, none of that. And it destroys Frodo in the process, by the way. But we'll come to that. Let me not ruin the whole course by going to the end at the beginning. But Frankenstein's clearly is talking about the same thing. The power of modern science over nature, and particular over another person. And there seems to be something particularly attractive about gaining power over other people. In terms of slavery, think about how humanity has been blighted from its early origins by the practice of slavery. Today we think about it in terms of the African slave trade, and of course there's a horrifying legacy of that, but it goes way back, further than that. It goes back into described in the Bible. Ancient Egypt. It's there. In Islam, it's always been a practice to this day of slavery. It's permissible under Islam. In fact, it's commanded, more or less. If something falls into your hand, you take it. In the Turkish Ottoman Empire, there were northern European slaves. They were particularly prized. Not quite sure why. I don't know. And so modern Turkey is filled with all manner of different looking people, sort of like Canada is now. In that sense, it's very multicultural. But then it was through slavery, and Ottoman ruler would just have this harem of women on end and children with them. And with the men, he would then just castrate them and make them slaves in that way. Symbolic. Heavily symbolic. This desire to control other people for the sake of your own power and your own dominion without restraint, which was fought against in the abolitionist movement of the 19th century, which got rid of slavery in Western Europe. Civil War was fought over it south of the border. Got rid of it for the second time, by the way. The first time was by Christians in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there was no slavery. Why? Because they recognized that every single person, irrespective of if they were Christian or not Christian, bore the image of God, and therefore they could not be made slaves of, because we have no power over other people. We can have power over animals. It's limited as well. We're to take care of them. But we have no right to enslave other people. So it stopped. And then it began again with the discovery of the New World. Slave trade was used, and the local inhabitants to some degree. Well, what are these people? Are they humans? They don't seem to recognize, we don't know what to do with them. The Pope in the day forbid people to make slaves of them. They ignored them. The Spanish and the Portuguese. Once they did it, well, you get a lot of power from having slaves. It's a hard thing to resist. We want to colonize the New World. Well, what are we going to do with it? Where are we going to get the people to do that? Well, you can capture some Irish and get them to do it. There are not enough Irish. We need more people. There is an Irish slave trade by the English, by the way. We need more. Well, let's go to Africa. They've always traded in slaves. We'll buy them from them. We'll buy them from the Muslims. Horrible. It's a terrible legacy. And the thing about it is that it marks all human beings throughout all human history. There is no culture that is exempt from this horrible practice. And sex slavery now in our day is on the rise, going through the roof. But never mind. So Frankenstein is using the Gothic novel, the medieval setting, to talk about an old form of knowledge that had a magical quality to it. And this attracted Victor. He was attracted to that aspect of it, something that would give him power, a sort of an illicit power. And he was transformed by this in his life when he witnessed firsthand a lightning bolt strike a tree. I think it's an oak tree. Oak trees are always symbolic in literature, and it reduced it to ribbons. It burnt it to, like, just totally destroyed it. Never saw such power. And then he became acquainted of modern science and how redundant and obsolete the old science is, and he gave up his interest in ancient science, the alchemy and so forth. But what attracted him about the medieval alchemy was the very same thing that attracted him about modern science: power. And the reason he looked down his nose at the old science is it just didn't deliver. But the desire was the same. He wanted power.